I never expected my quiet life to change because of a simple message. My name is Daniel. I was a 24-year-old university student studying biology. My life was ordinary: classes, late-night study sessions, and part-time work at the campus lab. Everything changed the night I met Lena. Lena was one of the smartest researchers in the university's experimental biology department. She was confident, mysterious, and always working on something unusual. One evening, while I was cleaning lab equipment, she approached me. "Daniel," she said with a slight smile, "I need someone trustworthy for an experiment." I laughed nervously. "What kind of experiment?" She looked around the empty lab before answering. "A hormone study." I didn't think much about it at first. Biology students volunteered for experiments all the time. But Lena's experiment was different. "It studies hormonal influence on emotional perception and identity," she explained. "That sounds complicated," I said. "It is," she replied calmly. "But I need someone open-minded." There was something about the way she said it that made me curious. "What would I have to do?" I asked. She opened a small metal case on the lab table. Inside were several small vials filled with a clear liquid. "These are experimental hormone regulators," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "You mean like testosterone blockers and estrogen regulators?" She smiled. "You catch on quickly." I suddenly felt unsure. "Wait, you want me to test hormones?" "Only temporarily," Lena said quickly. "The effects would be monitored closely. It's completely reversible." I hesitated. "This sounds risky." She crossed her arms and leaned closer. "Daniel, this could help us understand how hormones influence behavior and identity. It could be groundbreaking research." I looked at the vials again. Part of me wanted to say no. But another part of me, the curious scientist, wanted to know what would happen. What kind of changes would happen? I asked. Lena shrugged slightly. "Mostly emotional and physical adjustments. Nothing permanent." Her calm tone somehow made it sound safe. Still, something about the experiment felt mysterious, almost secretive. "Why me?" I asked. She smiled again. "Because you're observant, intelligent, and you're not afraid to question things." That answer felt strangely flattering. After a long moment of thinking, I finally said the words that would change everything. "Okay. I'll do it." Lena's eyes lit up. "Perfect." She prepared the first dose while explaining the schedule of the experiment. "We'll monitor your responses daily," she said. "Physical changes may take a few days." "Physical changes?" I asked nervously. She nodded casually. "Nothing dramatic at first." But when she handed me the small vial, I suddenly felt a strange sense of anticipation. I drank the liquid slowly. It tasted slightly sweet, almost harmless. But I had no idea that this tiny dose would begin a transformation that would shock me more than anything in my life. The next morning, when I woke up, something already felt different. And it was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up feeling strange. Not sick. Not tired. Just different. At first, I thought it was only my imagination. After all, Lena had said the hormone dose was small. But as I sat up in bed, I noticed something unusual. My body felt lighter. My movements felt softer somehow. I shook my head and laughed at myself. "Relax, Daniel," I muttered. "It's probably just placebo." Still, something felt off. When I walked to the mirror, I stared at my reflection carefully. Nothing obvious had changed. Same face. Same messy hair. But my skin looked clearer somehow. I frowned. "That's weird." A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Lena. "Lena. How do you feel this morning?" I replied quickly. "Me? Fine. Maybe a little strange." Hard to explain. Her response came almost immediately. Lena. Good. That means the hormones are interacting with your system. That sentence didn't exactly make me feel relaxed. Interacting with my system, I repeated quietly. I quickly got dressed and headed to the campus lab. When I arrived, Lena was already there. She was writing notes on a tablet while several test tubes sat on the counter. She looked up and smiled. Good morning, test subject. Very funny, I replied. She walked around me slowly, observing. How do you feel emotionally? I thought for a moment. Actually, a little more sensitive. Sensitive how? She asked. Hard to explain, I admitted. Music sounded stronger this morning. And I noticed small details more. Lena nodded, clearly interested. That's consistent with our hypothesis. I crossed my arms. Which is? That hormones influence perception more than people realize. She handed me a glass of water. Drink this. It helps stabilize the dose. I hesitated. Wait, there's more? She smiled slightly. Just a very small booster. I sighed. Well, I did agree to the experiment. I drank it. For a moment nothing happened. But about an hour later, I began noticing something else. My emotions felt stronger. When a sad song played in the background of the lab, I felt strangely moved by it. Okay, this is definitely weird, I said. Lena wrote something in her notes. Emotional amplification. Interesting. Then she suddenly asked a surprising question. Have you noticed any physical sensitivity? I blinked. What kind of question is that? She shrugged. Scientific curiosity. I rubbed my arms. My skin feels more sensitive, I guess. She nodded again. Expected. I stared at her. You say that like this was all planned. Of course it was, she said calmly. That night, when I returned to my apartment, I felt exhausted. But something else bothered me. When I put on my old hoodie, the fabric felt unusually soft against my skin. Almost comforting. I shook my head. This experiment is messing with my brain. But as I looked at myself in the mirror again, I noticed something I hadn't seen that morning. My face looked slightly different. Softer. Subtle, but noticeable. I leaned closer to the mirror. Wait, what? Suddenly my phone buzzed again. Another message from Lena. Lena. Tomorrow we begin phase 2. I stared at the message. My heart started beating faster. Phase 2. I suddenly realized something important. Lena never told me how many phases this experiment had. And deep down, I had the strange feeling that the real changes hadn't even started yet. The message from Lena stayed in my mind the entire night. Tomorrow we begin phase 2. I kept staring at my phone screen, wondering what exactly that meant. When I first agreed to the experiment, I imagined simple blood tests, maybe mood tracking, and small physical observations. But now it felt like something much bigger. Something I didn't fully understand. A strange morning. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. For a moment I just lay there, staring at the ceiling. Something felt different again. My body felt more sensitive. The bedsheet brushing against my skin felt strangely noticeable. I slowly got out of bed and walked to the mirror. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But when I leaned closer, I saw the same subtle change from last night. My face looked slightly softer. My skin smoother. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough that I noticed. Okay, that's definitely new, I said quietly. I splashed water on my face and tried to ignore it. But curiosity kept pulling me back to the mirror. Was this really from the hormones? Or was my mind just playing tricks on me? Back at the lab. When I arrived at the lab, Lena was already there again. But this time, the room looked different. Several pieces of monitoring equipment had been set up. Small sensors, medical scanners, and even a camera system. I stopped at the doorway. This looks serious. Lena turned around and smiled. Welcome to phase 2. I crossed my arms. You didn't say anything about turning the lab into a hospital. She laughed lightly. Relax. It's just for observation. I walked closer and looked at the machines. What exactly happens in phase 2? She picked up her tablet and showed me a chart. These hormones don't just influence physical chemistry, she explained. They affect how the brain interprets identity, emotion, and perception. I frowned. That sounds complicated. It is, she said calmly. She looked directly at me. Which is why phase 2 focuses on behavioral changes. Behavioral changes? I repeated. Yes. She walked around me again, studying my posture carefully. Stand normally, she said. I am standing normally. Not exactly, she replied. I blinked. What do you mean? She showed me a recording from yesterday. Then she compared it to how I was standing now. And I noticed something strange. My posture looked slightly different. More relaxed. Almost softer. That's weird, I muttered. The hormones are adjusting muscle response and body awareness, Lena said. That can't happen this fast. She smiled slightly. Biology can surprise you. The first test. Lena handed me a small device. We're going to do a sensory test. What kind of sensory test? Touch perception. I sighed. All right. She placed small fabric samples on the table. Cotton. Silk. Wool. Close your eyes, she said. I obeyed. Then she placed each fabric against my hand. Normally I probably wouldn't notice much difference. But this time. Everything felt more intense. The silk felt incredibly smooth. The cotton felt warm. Even the wool felt sharper. I opened my eyes. Okay, that's definitely stronger. Lena wrote something quickly. Enhanced tactile sensitivity, she whispered. I stared at her. You sound excited. Of course I am. The experiment is working. That sentence made my stomach tighten. Working? Working how exactly? The conversation. After the tests, we sat down at the lab table. I finally asked the question that had been bothering me. Lena, what exactly are you trying to prove? She thought for a moment before answering. Most people think identity is fixed, she said. But biology plays a much bigger role than people realize. I tilted my head. You mean hormones influence personality? Exactly. She leaned forward. And if we understand that influence, we can learn how flexible human identity really is. Her words were calm. But something about them felt unsettling. You're talking like identity can be changed, I said slowly. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she simply smiled. Another change. Later that evening, when I returned home, I felt exhausted again. The day had been long. Too many questions. Too many strange observations. I walked to the mirror one more time. And this time. The change was more noticeable. My jawline looked slightly softer. My eyes seemed brighter. It was subtle, but definitely different from a few days ago. I ran a hand through my hair nervously. This experiment is getting weird. Then my phone buzzed again. Another message from Lena. Lena. Good progress today. Tomorrow we begin the behavioral observation phase. I read the message twice. Behavioral observation? That didn't sound comforting. But what she sent next made my heart skip. Lena. Also, tomorrow you will try the clothing test. I stared at the screen. Clothing test? She had never mentioned that before. And suddenly, I realized phase 2 might be much stranger than I expected. I barely slept that night. Lena's last message kept repeating in my mind. Tomorrow you will try the clothing test. I had no idea what that meant, but something about it made me uneasy. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was go to the mirror again. And this time, the changes were impossible to ignore. My skin looked smoother than it had ever been before. My face seemed slightly slimmer, and even my eyes looked brighter. It was subtle enough that someone else might not notice immediately, but I could definitely see it. "This is getting weird," I whispered. For the first time since the experiment started, I wondered if I had made a mistake agreeing to it. But curiosity pushed me forward. I needed to know what Lena was really studying. Returning to the lab. The biology lab looked even more organized today. More equipment. More sensors. And on the large table in the center of the room, there was a neatly folded set of clothing. I immediately stopped walking. "Wait, that's the clothing test?" Lena turned around calmly. "Yes." I pointed at the clothes. "You're joking, right?" She shook her head. "No." The clothes on the table were clearly feminine, soft fabrics, light colors, and designs very different from anything I usually wore. "This experiment studies identity perception," she explained. "The clothing is part of that." I crossed my arms. "So you want me to wear that?" "Temporarily," she said. "For observation." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to refuse. But another part of me reminded me that I had already come this far. "What exactly are you observing?" I asked. "Behavior, posture, emotional response, and self-perception." That sounded incredibly complicated for something as simple as clothing. Still, science experiments often tested unusual things. After a long pause, I sighed. "Fine. But this is the weirdest experiment I've ever heard of." Lena smiled slightly. "That's why it's interesting." "The changing room." She pointed toward a small side room. "You can change in there." I picked up the clothes and walked inside. The room was quiet and brightly lit. I stared at the outfit in my hands for several seconds. "This is ridiculous," I muttered. But eventually, curiosity won again. I slowly changed. The fabric felt incredibly soft. Much softer than the clothes I normally wore. And because of the hormone sensitivity Lena mentioned, every texture felt stronger. When I finished, I stood in front of the mirror. For a moment, I didn't recognize the person looking back at me. The softer facial features from the hormone experiment made the appearance even more surprising. "Okay, that's strange," I said quietly. I took a deep breath and walked back into the lab. Lena's observation. The moment Lena saw me, she immediately began taking notes. "Interesting," she said. "That's your first reaction?" "Yes." She walked slowly around me again, observing carefully. "Stand naturally," she said. "I am standing naturally." She shook her head slightly. "Actually, your posture changed again." I looked confused. "What do you mean?" She showed me a monitor displaying recordings from previous days. Then she compared them to my current stance. And once again, something was different. My shoulders were slightly more relaxed. My movements looked smoother. "That's not intentional," I said quickly. "I know," Lena replied. "That's the point. The psychological effect." After several posture and movement tests, Lena asked a surprising question. "How do you feel emotionally right now?" I thought about it. "Honestly? Yes. Strangely calm." She raised an eyebrow. "Calm?"
Yeah.
I said slowly. "I thought I'd feel embarrassed, but I don't." Lena wrote something quickly on her tablet. "Fascinating." I leaned against the table. You keep saying that. Because the brain adapts faster than most people expect. Her explanation sounded logical, but it still felt strange. Then she added something unexpected. The hormones are also increasing emotional awareness. So that's why everything feels stronger? I asked. Yes. A new question. After several hours of testing, the experiment ended for the day. I changed back into my normal clothes and sat down at the lab table. But one thought kept bothering me. Lena, I said. Yes? How long is this experiment supposed to last? She paused for a moment before answering. Originally? 2 weeks. Originally? She looked at me carefully. But the results are developing faster than expected. That sentence made me nervous. What does that mean? She smiled slightly. It means phase 3 might begin earlier. I frowned. There's a phase 3 too? Of course. I leaned back in the chair. You really should have told me all the phases before I agreed. She laughed quietly. Where would the surprise be in that? The unexpected message. Later that night, I returned home feeling mentally exhausted. The experiment was becoming more complicated every day. But something else was changing too. My curiosity was growing. Despite how strange everything felt, I wanted to see where the experiment would lead. As I sat on my bed thinking about it, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Lena. Lena. Tomorrow we begin the final stage of observation. I read it slowly. Final stage? But the next message shocked me even more. Lena. You might be surprised by what happens next. I stared at the screen. Because after everything I had already experienced, I wasn't sure I was ready for any more surprises. Lena's message about the final stage of observation kept running through my mind the entire night. I didn't know why, but it made me uneasy. The experiment had already changed more things than I expected. My emotions felt stronger. My senses were more sensitive. Even my appearance had subtly changed over the past few days. And now Lena was saying the final stage was about to begin. A nervous morning. The next morning, I woke up feeling strangely nervous. For the first time since the experiment started, I actually hesitated before going to the lab. I stood in front of the mirror again. The changes were still subtle, but definitely real. My skin looked smoother than before. My facial features looked slightly softer. Even my hair felt different, lighter and easier to style. I sighed. This experiment is really doing something. Part of me wanted to stop. But another part of me, the curious biology student, needed to see the final results. So I grabbed my jacket and headed to the university. Lena's new setup. When I arrived at the lab, Lena had prepared something new. The room lights were dimmer. More cameras had been installed. And several computer monitors displayed different readings. Good morning, she said calmly. You look serious today, I replied. She smiled. Because today is the most important part of the experiment. I sat down in the chair across from her. So what exactly is the final stage? She handed me a small tablet. On the screen were several graphs showing hormone levels, emotional responses, and physical changes. These are your results from the past week, she explained. I studied the graphs carefully. Even though I was a biology student, I was surprised by how fast the numbers were changing. My hormone levels shifted this much? I asked. Yes. And the emotional response index doubled. I leaned back in the chair. That's insane. Lena nodded. It means the experiment worked. The real purpose. I crossed my arms. All right. I need the truth now. The truth? Yes, I said seriously. You've been studying hormones and identity changes, but what's the real goal of this experiment? For the first time since the experiment started, Lena hesitated. Then she sat down across from me. The real purpose, she said slowly, is to understand how flexible human identity can be. I frowned. Flexible how? She tapped the screen again. Hormones influence emotions, perception, confidence, and behavior. That part one understand. But what if those biological signals change how someone sees themselves? I blinked. You mean, identity could change too? Exactly. Her answer made the entire experiment suddenly feel bigger. This wasn't just about physical reactions. It was about understanding how deeply biology affects who we are. The observation test. For the final stage, Lena ran several psychological tests. Some were simple. Emotional response tests. Reaction time experiments. Sensory perception tests. But one test was different. Stand in front of the mirror, she said. I did. Then she asked something unexpected. How do you see yourself right now? I looked at my reflection carefully. The same subtle changes were still there. But something else had changed too. My confidence. My posture. My awareness of myself. It's strange, I admitted. What is? I feel different. Different how? I thought carefully before answering. More aware of myself. Lena nodded slowly. That's exactly what the experiment predicted. A surprising result. After several hours of testing, Lena reviewed all the data. She looked genuinely shocked. What? I asked. These numbers, they're higher than expected. Higher? She turned the screen toward me. Your adaptability score is extremely high. I laughed nervously. Is that good or bad? From a scientific perspective, it's amazing. But then she said something that surprised me even more. Your brain adapted to the hormonal changes faster than any test subject in previous trials. I froze. Previous trials? She looked slightly embarrassed. Yes, this isn't the first time the experiment has been tested. Lena. I said loudly. She raised her hands. Relax, everything was monitored safely. The final decision. By evening, the final results were ready. The experiment had successfully proven Lena's theory. Hormones could influence not only physical responses, but emotional and psychological perception as well. But now there was one final question. What happens now? I asked. Lena looked thoughtful. The hormone levels will slowly return to normal. So everything goes back to how it was? Mostly, she said. Mostly? There may be small lasting changes in emotional awareness. I leaned back in my chair. That's a lot to process. She smiled slightly. You did something very important for science. I laughed. Next time I volunteer for an experiment, remind me to ask more questions first. The message that changed everything. That night, when I finally returned home, I felt relieved. The experiment was over. Or at least, that's what I thought. As I sat on my bed, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Lena. But this one was very short. Lena. There's something important I didn't tell you. My heart skipped. I typed back quickly. Me? What? Her reply came a few seconds later. Lena. The experiment may not be completely finished. I stared at the screen. Because after everything that had happened, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear what came next. Lena's message kept me awake for hours. The experiment may not be completely finished. I stared at the phone screen again and again, trying to understand what she meant. The entire week had already been filled with strange changes, emotional tests, and confusing discoveries. And now she was telling me it wasn't over? Finally, I replied. Me? What do you mean it's not finished? Several minutes passed before her response appeared. Lena. Come to the lab tomorrow morning. I'll explain everything. That answer only made me more nervous. Returning one last time. The next morning felt different from the others. This time I wasn't just curious. I was worried. As I walked through the quiet university halls toward the lab, my thoughts raced. Had something gone wrong? Was there a side effect Lena didn't tell me about? When I entered the lab, Lena was already there, standing near the computer monitors. But her expression was more serious than I had ever seen before. You came, she said. Of course I came, I replied quickly. You said the experiment wasn't finished. She nodded slowly. Yes, because there's one final result we needed to observe. I crossed my arms. Lena, I need the truth now. She walked over to the monitor and turned it toward me. The screen displayed several graphs, hormone levels, neural response patterns, and emotional tracking data. These are your results from the entire experiment, she said. I looked carefully at the graphs. Even without reading the details, I could see something unusual. The lines weren't returning to their original levels. They're not going back to normal, I said quietly. Lena nodded. Not completely. The real discovery. She took a deep breath before continuing. The purpose of the experiment wasn't just to see if hormones could influence behavior. Then what was it? I asked. It was to see whether the brain could adapt to new biological signals faster than we expected. I frowned. And? She pointed to one specific graph. This line shows neural adaptability. The line was extremely high. Your brain adapted almost immediately, she said. That means your mind adjusted to the hormone changes faster than the body itself. I leaned against the table. So what does that mean for me? It means you experienced a rare level of biological adaptability. That sounds scientific, I said, but what does it actually mean? She smiled slightly. It means you discovered something about yourself. A new perspective. For a moment, the lab became completely quiet. Then Lena asked a question I didn't expect. Do you feel like the same person you were before the experiment? I thought about it carefully. Physically, I felt mostly the same. But emotionally, mentally, something had definitely changed. I feel more aware of myself, I admitted. Exactly, Lena said. The experiment didn't change who you are. Then what did it change? It changed how clearly you understand yourself. Her explanation surprised me. This whole time I thought the experiment was about physical transformation. But it turned out to be something deeper. It was about understanding identity and perception. The end of the experiment. Lena closed the experiment files and shut down the monitors. Well, she said, that concludes the research. That's it? I asked. That's it. I laughed a little. So after all that, the final result is self-awareness? In a way, yes. She walked toward the door and turned off the lab lights. You helped prove something important. What's that? That human identity is more flexible and complex than people realize. One last conversation. Before leaving, I stopped at the doorway. Lena? Yes? If you ran this experiment again, would you still choose me? She smiled. Absolutely. Why? Because curiosity is the most powerful trait a scientist can have. I laughed. Next time I'm asking a lot more questions before volunteering. That's probably a good idea. A new beginning. As I walked out of the laboratory building, the evening sun was setting across the campus. The experiment had started as a simple scientific study. But it ended up teaching me something unexpected. Sometimes the biggest discoveries aren't about changing who we are. They're about understanding ourselves more clearly. And as I walked home, I realized something strange. The experiment might have ended. But the experience would stay with me for the rest of my life. The end.